Before the Boston Tea Party, the spark that lit the American Revolution was a tree. Not a metaphor. A real physical fight over property, power, and money that turned ordinary sawmill owners into the first violent rebels of the Revolution, years before anyone dumped a single crate of tea into a harbor. So how did a tree almost start a war 3 years before the war actually started? To understand why, you have to understand what the eastern white pine actually meant to the British Empire. By the time England began colonizing North America, its own forests had been cut down over centuries of shipbuilding and war. There wasn't a tree left on the island capable of producing a proper mast for a Royal Navy warship. Then explorers sailed into New England and found something they hadn't seen anywhere else. Pines over 200 feet tall, with trunks running arrow straight and branch free for 80 feet or more. A single one of these trees, several hundred years old, could weigh around 10 tons. For a navy that ruled the seas by the size and strength of its ships, this wasn't a nice to have. It was the difference between naval dominance and falling behind. And when the crown found a resource this valuable sitting on land, it didn't fully control, it didn't try to buy it. It simply declared the trees belonged to the king. In 1691, the Massachusetts Bay Charter quietly reserved every pine tree over 24 inches in diameter for the Royal Navy, regardless of whose land it stood on. Royal surveyors were sent into the forest to find these trees and mark them with 3 quick hatchet strikes shaped like an arrowhead. The King's Broad Arrow. It was the same symbol used across the British Empire to brand property as belonging to the crown. And now it was showing up on trees colonists had grown up around. In some cases on land their own families had cleared and farmed for generations. Cut one down without permission, and you could face a fine equal to months, sometimes years, of a working man's income. Over the next 3 decades, the policy spread across New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, and Nova Scotia, and in 1722 it got worse. The protected size dropped to just 12 inches, meaning far more trees and far more colonists suddenly fell under royal control. Picture it plainly. The government was marking trees on your own land and telling you they weren't yours anymore. So by the early 1700s, colonists legally couldn't touch the biggest trees on their own property. Naturally, they didn't listen. For decades, colonists fought back the only way they safely could, quietly. They cut marked trees anyway and burned away the royal mark with axes or fire. They chopped down a valuable pine and slapped the King's Broad Arrow onto a worthless one instead, just to throw off the inspectors. Prime timber kept turning up at market with suspiciously clean bark, no mark in sight. When enforcement did show up in person, it didn't always go well for the crown. In 1734, in what's now Fremont, New Hampshire, a royal surveyor arrived to inspect felled logs and found himself run out of town by locals disguised as Native Americans. 2 years later, in Exeter, a surveying party sent to seize marked logs was jumped, beaten, and had its boat sunk by residents wearing the same kind of disguise. For most of this period, the crown mostly let these incidents slide because enforcing the law consistently across an entire wilderness was nearly impossible. That changed in 1766 when a new governor took over in New Hampshire, one who was about to make enforcement personal. That governor was John Wentworth, and unlike a lot of royal officials, colonists actually liked him. But when it came to the king's pines, he didn't bend. In 1771, he sent his deputy surveyor to search sawmills across the colony for illegally cut timber, and the search turned up 6 mills breaking the law. 2 of them in a small town called Weir. The other 4 mill owners paid their fines without much fuss. The men in Weir, led by a mill owner named Ebenezer Mudgett, refused. On April 13th, 1772, the local sheriff rode out with his deputy to arrest Mudgett. Mudgett didn't resist. He simply told them he'd post bail in the morning, and they let him go for the night. That was a mistake. While the sheriff and his deputy slept at the local inn, more than 20 men gathered at Mudgett's house to plan what came next. At dawn, they burst into the sheriff's room, faces blackened with soot, and beat him half-conscious with tree switches. One strike, they said, for every tree the Crown had marked. His deputy got the same treatment in the room next door. Before sending both men out of town, the rioters cut the ears off their horses and hacked away their manes and tails, just to make sure nobody in the next town over could mistake what had happened. When it finally went to trial that September, 8 men were convicted of rioting and assault. Their punishment? 20 shillings each plus court costs. That's it. Ask yourself what that verdict actually says. A sheriff nearly beaten to death, a deputy dragged from his bed, and the Crown's own courts could only muster a slap on the wrist. It tells you the Crown's grip on this corner of its empire was already slipping, 3 full years before a single shot was fired at Lexington. The pine didn't stop mattering once the riot ended. One of the judges who handed down that lenient sentence, Meshach Ware, went on to help write New Hampshire's first state constitution and became its first president. Several of the men who beat that sheriff in 1772 later picked up muskets and fought in the Revolutionary War outright. And the tree itself outgrew the courtroom entirely. By 1775, when George Washington sent out his first small fleet of armed ships, they flew a flag with a pine tree on it. Some accounts place a similar pine tree flag at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The same species the Crown had spent nearly a century trying to claim by force had become the literal symbol stitched onto the banners of the people fighting to throw that crown out. Some historians go further and argue that the decades-long fight over these pines mattered just as much to the coming revolution as the taxation of tea. Not a universally settled claim, but a serious one worth taking seriously, given how far back this particular grievance actually stretches. So the next time you hear the Boston Tea Party described as the spark of the American Revolution, remember there was another spark first, quieter and buried in the woods of New Hampshire. A tree the Crown tried to seize by force became the symbol carried by the people who refused to let it. If a 200-foot pine tree can quietly help set off a revolution, it's worth asking what other small grievances never made it into the history books. If this kind of story is your thing, there's another one waiting for you right here.